One. Any questions up to this point?
They didn't have dog tags that identified them in the First World War?
Well, they kind of sort of did. They had paper discs.
Yeah. Compressed
Card,
paper. Yeah.
compressed cardboard kind of things, right? On a leather strand.
Yeah.
But that was more for just your general ground troops. These guys were flyers, still Army. But one thing you have to keep in mind, you know, especially in the earlier part of the war, anybody who was flying was generally a little more well off.
Yeah.
You know, they came from, generally speaking, well-to-do families. Okay, so generally you would think that they would have identification, but in a lot of circumstances they didn't.
Was that kid's school tie on the grave?
It was
Just
indeed. So during the rededication ceremony, a contingent from the Brahms Grove School came over. So we had some kids there from the school, and they were awesome. They put their school tie on his grave as a memento, which I thought was fantastic. 3 Squadron today still exists. They fly the Typhoon, which is a modern fighter jet, and they're in the north of England. And for that rededication ceremony, they were up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, boarded a bus, drove all the way down to the ferry terminal there in Dover. Crossed over, drove another hour and a bit to get down into the Somme, did the ceremony, came and did the reception afterwards, boarded the bus, and drove all the way back home, all in the same day. So the fact that they did that for their own, because the following day I went to another ceremony to a Canadian soldier I identified in near Amant, and there was 5 Canadian members of it. Yeah, I mean, there were 6 people at that event total, which was really kind of disappointing to me. But I mean, the Royal Air Force pulled out the stops for this, which gave me a lot of satisfaction. So, as a former intelligence officer, one of the things that we always used to say when you've done something is to question it by saying, "So what?" So what? Okay, you did that, so what? Well, the so what that I would like to convey to you is something else that I do here now, is I work with the Last Post Fund. I'm on the board of directors. That's our logo there. But I go around, and one of the things that I'm responsible for is the Unmarked Graves program here in Nova Scotia. Okay, and that's for veterans that, because of limited means, they were buried and maybe they couldn't afford a headstone, the family couldn't afford it. Well, I'm looking for those headstones, or I'm looking for those locations of where those people are buried. So I'm going to talk about that for just a couple of minutes. So, just a little background about the Last Post Fund. It's been around since 1909. We actually exist before the Canadian Legion kicks off. And basically how it all started was there was a gentleman by the name of Arthur Hare. He was a former British soldier, and he was a hospital orderly in Montreal. One night, policemen show up with this gentleman who looks inebriated, and they drop him off, and basically the man passes away. Well, it's not because he was drunk or anything, he was malnourished. he had nothing to eat, and he just wasn't functioning well. But the issue, or the thing that Arthur Hare figured out was, when they were recovering the effects from the body, Arthur Hare noticed he had a blue pay book on him. And that pay book was his record of service from his time in the Boer War. So Arthur Hare recognized that this guy was a veteran, and now he was basically going to be thrown in the hole as, you know, a bum, you know, like an unknown guy. And Arthur Hare had an issue with that, and what he did was he went around to other medical orderlies who had served in the army and said, hey, would you mind, you know, putting some money together and we'll give this guy a proper burial. So that starts in 1909, and we've been continuing on ever since. So the primary mission of the Last Post Fund is basically that we will ensure that any veteran who qualifies under the program will receive a dignified burial and a marker for their grave. Okay. Not all veterans pass away with enough means for them to get the burial they require, and that's what we're all about. So the Unmarked Grave Program, so this was done in 1996. So the person should not have a grave that, it basically can't have been marked less than 5 years. Okay? And I say who lie in unmarked graves or have a temporary marker. Now, a temporary marker, if you know of anyone that may have been a veteran and maybe they have a wooden cross, that would qualify them for a headstone. And if any of you know about anything like that, contact me, or you can contact Kel in the back and he can put you in touch with me. All right? And I'll get that person a headstone. I need help. You know, it's just me. And I don't know if you guys, anybody have a guess how many cemeteries there are in Nova Scotia? Just for fun? Anyone? Just throw a number out. Somebody, let's start a game. Come on.
Where's the book?
So
4,000.
no, less than that.
I was
But
gonna say two.
we're the Provincial Archives mentions there's 2,002 cemeteries in Nova Scotia. I can do some of those, and I have, but it's a lot of territory to cover. Okay. Anyway, if you do know of a veteran that doesn't have a headstone, please let me know, and I'll look after that. And VAC is currently estimating that there's 3,000 to 5,000 unmarked graves still to be recovered in Canada. So it's just some quick statistics. So you can see, you know, there's a couple of blips here. Generally, you know, in the 300 range per year is what we're doing. The reason for the spike in the latter years here is because in Mountain View Cemetery in BC, they hundreds of unmarked veteran graves just in one cemetery alone. So they rolled ahead and just this huge spike. This program also exists for Canadian veterans who have also passed on, but are in the United States. It could be in Britain. It doesn't matter. If they're a Canadian veteran and they don't have a headstone, we will put one on for them. Okay, here's the so what for you guys in relation to the unmarked program. So, what's the cemetery again? Oak Lawn? Oak?
Maplewood.
Maple Oak?
Maplewood.
Maplewood.
Yeah.
Maplewood Cemetery. So my in-laws live 4 doors down from there, so of course I see a cemetery, I walk into it and I'm like, okay, so what do we have here? So here's an example of an unmarked grave. So so you know where the stone walls are for Maplewood?
Maplewood, yeah.
Maplewood?
Yeah.
So when you go through that gate, immediately on your left-hand side, here's a cross that's marking the grave. There's no marking to the veteran at all. So I got to figure out who's there. And that's of interest to me, because that would qualify for a headstone. And what I think is really neat about the cemetery there is the Legion and the British Empire Service League, which was the predecessor to the Legion.
Yeah.
They marked all of these veterans' graves. Has everybody gone in that cemetery? Did you notice the aluminum crosses? Awesome. It makes my life considerably easier, because here's this guy. Notice he doesn't have a grave or a marker anymore. But luckily, when the British Empire Service League put that cross in, they marked his name, and there he is there, Lieutenant Peter McCullough Fielding. He was a probate judge after the war, First World War. He was sent over to the UK, and basically he was with the railway troops.
Okay,
And he came back and passed away. He must have had a headstone at one point, but he doesn't have one now. So all I need to do is figure out the plot location of that location and put it down on paper, submit it, and then Mr. McCullough or Fielding will get a headstone.
Good news, we have the map upstairs.
Yeah,
They
so
have very good records of Maplewood upstairs.
Yeah.
The
Well,
the lot numbers, the names in the lot, the whole bit.
there are, I would say, a lot more unmarked graves there that probably have veterans in them. But the fact that people had known from years past and had marked those locations. So here's two that are ready to go. They just need a little bit of polish and for the submission. You know, Mr. Fielding obviously is an easy one to do. But this other one requires a little bit of digging into the weeds and having a look. So if anybody within the historical community can contribute to that.
Is the one on the left also a service league marker,
Yes,
but it doesn't have a
there's no
serial
name.
number or name?
No,
Oh, okay.
no. Now that could be simply somebody saw one laying there and they just planted it back there. I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you guys have the records, you should be able to correlate if,
Mhm.
you know, there's somebody in there. Of interest in that cemetery as well, the Legion has their own plot.
Yep.
And that, to me, is another area of required research. Because there's a lot of names listed there, and I'm not certain if all of the graves have been accounted for. So that needs to be looked at. I mean, this is just one. I mean, I could spend the rest of my life, you know, poking around in just a few cemeteries, let alone 2,000 of them. So this is what happens. These are the standard headstones that are provided for by the Last Post Fund. Now, where you see the Latin cross, we can actually order that soldier's regimental affiliation. So if he was a member of the Royal Canadian Regiment, for example, we can have that cap badge put up there, and Air Force, Navy, whatever. But that gives you, that's generally what is found. Unless the cemetery dictates otherwise, and then they get foot markers. And these are provided, again, no cost to the families. If they know of their loved ones and they're looking for a headstone, we'll give them one. Any questions?
Where does the money come from for the headstones?
So we have 3 programs under the Last Post Fund. We have the funeral and burial program for veterans. So if a veteran doesn't meet a certain financial threshold, and it's actually pretty generous, there's that program. We have the unmarked grave program, and then we also have the matter of right, meaning if a veteran passes on and it's due to his specific illness that he sustained while he was in the military, automatically covered. But all of those programs are underwritten by BAC. And they basically contract the program out to the Last Post Fund because we've been doing it for over 100 years now. Okay, so that's where the money comes from.
Nice.
Any other
Not
questions?
so much a question, but do you mind if I make a comment about the graveyards?
Yep.
If it's something I really found interesting when I first encountered. Could you pop that back to your very first picture of the two tombstones?
The,
It was almost, I think it was your first picture. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment here, because my son and I were in the Bergen-op-Zoom Cemetery about 5 or so years ago. And as you looked around, the cemeteries are all very similar. And call it, they're very regimented, you know, it's obviously the tombstones are the same size. It's pretty much the same distance between each one. But we found in one spot there was like 7 or 8 tombstones, and they're right up against each other. And that entrance, which I found unusual, and they were all marked, they were all named. It wasn't any unknown soldiers in there. And then at the front of the cemetery, in the little room there, they had a booklet that explained some things, and luckily it explained that in there. And what that was that was something like they know who's buried there. So there's 7 tombstones, they know the 7 names and everything. They don't know which one is which. But they know who's there, because if it was an aircraft that was shot down, there was a manifest who was on that aircraft.
yeah,
Yeah.
But at the time, they weren't able to identify who was who. So they're still there as a crew. It just, Joe might have Bob's headstone though,
Yeah.
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 right above his head. But I found that really interesting. I think you could almost see back there's a few that are really close to each other.
Yep.
So, you know, those may be the same. Again, like you said, I don't know if that was the practice at every cemetery.
I was told when I was over there that the officers got buried farther apart than the enlisted men.
I don't believe that. Like, you know, because the whole concept of the War Graves Commission was you will be commemorated regardless of your status.
Right.
Okay? The other rule was the dead were not to be repatriated. They were going to be buried near to where they fell. And there was another rule, I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, sorry, that one escapes me. Those are 2 key ones, okay? So it didn't matter if you were, you know, I've been to cemeteries like that where you've got a brigadier general and right beside him is a private soldier.
This is Batman.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, you talk about air crews. My lawyer, for when I closed my house, her husband's great uncle was killed in the Second World War. He was part of a bomber crew that was conducting a mission over Germany. So I did some research for them, and I put together the final hours of that air crew. And basically, I came across the RCAF and the RAF went to great lengths after the war to figure out where their bomber crews went. I mean, they sent guys deep into the heart of Germany and everything else like that to determine, okay, what happened with the crash. And subsequently, you know, they would draft a report, and my God, when you read some of this stuff, I mean, the one report I read, I was in tears because, you know, they talked about, you know, the aircraft pancaked, you know, right into the ground. And, you know, the German witness said, well, there was 7 people on that airplane, but they carried 2 caskets out. So, you know, like, anyway.
Yeah.
It's just the way it goes. So, anyway, there's still quite a few people that are kind of like-minded to what the research I do, and you know, a lot of missing are coming out of the cold now, largely because the internet. You can dig into archives that were not necessarily available
Yeah.
to people 10 years ago. So all of these little tidbits of information are stowed on hard drives all across the planet, and it's picking those pieces of information and lining them up accordingly, and then making some sense of what the information entails. And this is a case of where the planets lined up perfectly. Anyway, so that's it for today.
Well, I wanna thank you very much, Steve, for, talking to us today, and,
Thank you very much.
personally, I thank you for the work that you do. It's amazing. We have a little present for you. You know what it is, because we were looking at it earlier.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna ask the author of this work to come up here with us. Come on up, Bill. I know you hate this stuff. And I'm gonna get Bill to present this book to you on soldiers of the First World War from Hants County.
Nice to meet you, very good talk. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to receive your work. This kind of stuff is critical to a lot of the things that I do. And, this information may eventually provide a soldier with a headstone.
Yes, I know there's a few from Maplewood that are in here that I don't know, I've never been to look at their actual grave to see if.
And this is where it all starts. I'm gonna warn you.
Rabbit hole.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But there are unmarked graves in Maplewood,
yeah.
and I would love to see them commemorated properly. And one of the things I could possibly suggest too is if there's a teenager that might be interested in working towards the Duke of Edinburgh Award,
Exactly.
I would be
Yeah.
willing to take them under my wing, and they could use some of that time as community service. So I'm just putting it out there.
That's good because we have the King's Edge Hill Black Watch Cadets, and we also have the Air Force, the Air Cadets here.
If they're willing
So
to dig into.
we'll put feelers out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'd be happy to work with that, but I saw your book and I was kind of like, oh. This is the stuff I live and breathe.
Right.
It makes me happy. Thanks for your work.